The room was thick with smoke and the hum of conversation. The Nag's Head pub on London Road in High Wycombe was packed, as it always was on a Friday night. I was just 17, and the saloon bar was my world. Punk bands played here, and the walls were plastered with band flyers and graffiti. That night, the jukebox blared out The Clash and the Sex Pistols, and the regulars were deep in their own little worlds, drinking, laughing, and arguing. Ron Watts, the pub owner, was behind the bar, his eyes scanning the crowd. He knew everyone, and everyone knew him. I was with a group of friends, David, Ross, Julian, and Russell. We were all about the same age, and we spent most of our time here, plotting our next moves, dreaming big and living in the moment. It was a normal night, or so it seemed. The atmosphere was electric, and we were all buzzing. But then, out of nowhere, the room fell silent. Someone had said it. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Elvis is dead. At first, it was a murmur. Then it became a whisper that spread like wildfire. People turned to each other, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. My friends and I looked at each other, trying to process what we had just heard. It was impossible. Elvis couldn't be dead. He was bigger than life, a legend, a king, but the news was confirmed. The radio was playing an Elvis song, and the DJ voice cut through the music, confirming the worst. Elvis Presley has died at the age of 42. The bar erupted into a mix of reactions. Some people cheered half-heartedly, as if they didn't know what to do with the news. Others were in tears, their faces twisted in grief. The barman tried to keep the peace, but the atmosphere was charged. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was real. Elvis was gone. My friends and I were in shock. We were too young to remember Elvis's early days, but he was a part of our world, a constant presence in the background of our lives. We weren't die-hard fans, but we knew his music, his impact. We knew that this was a moment that would be etched in history. We spent the rest of the night in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. The jukebox was playing nothing but Elvis songs, and people were crowding around it, trying to get their favorite tracks on. But the mood was somber. No one was dancing, no one was laughing. The world had changed, and we were all feeling it. Then Sid walked in. Sid, or Sid, as he had rebranded himself, was our unofficial leader. He was a few years older, and he had a mystique about him. He always seemed to be somewhere else, lost in his own world. He was our connection to the past, the one who could drive us to parties, festivals, and gigs. He was the one who knew all the good music, the one who could always find the funny side of any situation. But tonight, he looked different. He walked to the bar, ordered a pint of snakebite, and sat down by himself. We could see that he had been crying. His eyes were red, and he didn't want to talk. We all knew why. Elvis was his hero, his idol. He had grown up with Elvis, and now his hero was gone. The rest of the night was a blur. We tried to keep the conversation going, but it was hard. The news kept coming back to us, like a punch in the gut. We were young, and we didn't understand the full weight of what had happened. But we knew it was big, and we knew it was sad. As the night wore on, the bar slowly emptied. People left still in shock, still trying to process the news. We stayed, sitting in silence, the jukebox playing Elvis's greatest hits. The world had changed, and we were all trying to figure out what that meant for us. Elvis had left the building, and we were left to pick up the pieces. The summer of 1977 was a time of change, and Elvis Presley's death on August 16th marked a significant shift. For many, it felt like the end of an era. Elvis had always been a symbol of the American dream, a poor boy from the South who became a global superstar. His music, charisma, and stage presence had defined rock and roll in its heyday. But by the time he died, Elvis had become a parody of his former self, weighed down by his struggles with weight, drugs, and the relentless pressure of fame. When he passed away, it was as if the youthful energy and rebellion of early rock and roll had died with him. In the Nag's Head pub that night, the greasy 20 and 30-somethings mourned in their own way. They were dressed in denim and leather, with long hair and big black quiffs, looking like they were still trapped in the 1950s. Despite their appearance, they were all much older, but in their hearts they were still teenagers, dreaming of the glory days of rock and roll. It was a moment that felt like a final goodbye to their youth, a James Dean moment where the rebellious spirit of the past was laid to rest. Elvis's death had a very different impact in the United States compared to Diana, Princess of Wales's death 2 decades later. When Diana died, there was a national outpouring of grief. Her capacity for empathy had touched the hearts of millions, and her funeral procession was watched by 3 million people. The new Labour government, led by Tony Blair, even tried to capitalize on the moment, using it to signal a new political era. But Elvis's death was different. It wasn't co-opted by anyone. It belonged to the baby boomers, the generation that had grown up with Elvis. For them, he was more than just a celebrity. He was a part of their lives, a symbol of the American dream. Elvis's journey was a classic rags to riches story, but it also had a dark side. He had lived the American dream to the fullest, but the price was high. His early success and fame had come at the cost of his health and well-being. Some saw his death as a form of divine retribution, a punishment for his excesses and the false god he had become. But for many, Elvis was more than just a fallen idol. He was a reminder that life is finite, and that success and fame can be fleeting. For those living far away, like the author, Elvis's death was a distant echo. The initial shock was real, but life quickly moved on. The author was more interested in the next concert or the next visit to the 100 Club. Elvis had become a cliché, a stereotypical old man's music, and his influence on the youth of 1970s Britain was minimal. He was seen as a relic of a bygone era, more suited to TV commercials and radio too than the vibrant punk scene. But Elvis's legacy was far from over. His death only solidified his iconic status. He became a pop icon in life and a religious figure in death, a modern-day martyr whose story was filled with both triumph and tragedy. His music, though overplayed, still held a special place in the hearts of many. When an old Elvis hit played on the radio, it brought a sense of nostalgia and a smile, even if the power of the song had faded over time. Elvis's relationship with punk rock was complex. Punk set out to reject everything that Elvis represented as commercial success, his mainstream appeal, and his polished image. But punk's rebellion was also a response to the same cultural forces that had shaped Elvis's rise. In a way, Elvis had already destroyed himself before punk could. His decline and death were a cautionary tale, a reminder that the American dream could be both a blessing and a curse. The summer of 1977 was also the summer of Star Wars. George Lucas's space epic had taken the world by storm, breaking box office records and changing the face of cinema. It was a film that captured the imagination of audiences, young and old, and it felt like a new beginning. While Elvis's death marked the end of one era, Star Wars ushered in another. It was a story of heroes and villains, of good versus evil, and it resonated with people in a way that few films had before. Fleetwood Mac's album Rumors was another cultural touchstone of that summer. Released in February, it dominated the charts and became a soundtrack for a generation. The album's blend of pop sensibility and emotional depth reflected the complex personal lives of its creators. It was music that spoke to the highs and lows of relationships, and it found a home in the hearts of listeners across the country. As the summer of 1977 drew to a close, the world was changing. Elvis was gone, but his legend lived on. Star Wars had opened a new frontier, and Fleetwood Mac had captured the spirit of the times. It was a year that would be remembered for its endings and its beginnings, for the loss of a king and the birth of new dreams. The year 1977 was a roller coaster of music, politics, and cultural shift. Fleetwood Mac's album Rumors became a timeless classic, capturing the raw emotions and personal dramas of the band members. The album's creation was intense, with relationships breaking down and drug use fueling their creative fire. Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks' romance crumbled, and John and Christine McVie's marriage also fell apart. Despite the chaos, the band produced a masterpiece that resonated with listeners. The songs were a mix of heartbreak, love, and reflection, all wrapped in those unforgettable harmonies that made you feel like you were driving down a California highway, even if you were just stuck in traffic on a British motorway. While Fleetwood Mac was making waves, other genres were also experiencing a revival. Bossa Nova, a style that had been popular in the early 1960s, made a comeback thanks to Joe Gilberto's album Amoroso. The lush orchestration and smooth melodies of songs like Wave could be heard on beaches around the world from Miami to Rio. It was a refreshing sound that reminded people of sunnier days. In the film industry, Woody Allen's Annie Hall was a breakthrough. The movie turned Allen into a household name and made Diane Keaton's quirky style a fashion trend. The film was a romantic comedy that resonated with audiences, and it won 4 Academy Awards. It was a love letter to New York, showcasing the city as a place of sophistication and charm. Meanwhile, in the world of rock, Led Zeppelin set a new world record for an indoor concert, packing 76,229 people into the Pontiac Silverdome. The band's energy and stage presence were unmatched, and the concert was a testament to their enduring popularity. 1977 was also a year of significant political events. Spain held its first democratic elections in over 40 years, marking the end of General Franco's dictatorship. In the United States, the Supreme Court ruled on the legality of Medicaid funding for elective abortions, and South African anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko died in police custody, sparking international outrage. The United States was still healing from the Watergate scandal, and Jimmy Carter, the new president, was seen as a breath of fresh air. He promised to restore trust in the government and bring a sense of hope to the nation. However, the year was not without its tragedies. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley, one of America's most beloved icons, died, leaving a void in the music world. Television also had its share of memorable moments. The miniseries Roots, based on Alex Haley's novel, was a groundbreaking event. It told the story of Kunta Kinte and his descendants, shedding light on the brutal history of slavery. The series was a critical and commercial success, winning multiple awards and breaking audience records. Another significant television moment was the broadcast of David Frost's interviews with former President Richard Nixon. The interviews were a journalistic coup, providing a rare glimpse into the mind of a disgraced leader. In the world of technology, Apple launched the Apple II, its first personal computer. This marked the beginning of a new era in computing, making technology more accessible to the average person. In Britain, 1977 was a year of contrasts. The country was struggling with economic issues and social unrest, but it also celebrated the silver jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. The week-long festivities, including the lighting of beacons and street parties, brought a sense of unity and pride to the nation. The Queen's procession through London was a spectacle, with over 1 million people lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the royal family. However, the year was also marked by the rise of punk rock. Punk was a rebellion against the excesses of the music industry and the status quo. Bands like the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and the Clash were at the forefront of this movement. Their music was raw, fast, and often politically charged. Punk fashion was as much a part of the scene as the music, with safety pins, leather jackets, and spiky hair becoming symbols of the movement. London was the epicenter of punk, with bands like the Clash and the Jam writing songs that captured the city's spirit. The Clash's debut album was a tribute to the neighborhoods of North Kensington and Ladbroke Grove, while the Jam's songs painted a picture of urban life in the city. Punk was about reinvention and DIY ethics, and it inspired a generation to create their own music and fashion. Punk was more than just a musical genre. It was a way of life. It spoke to the frustrations and aspirations of young people who felt disconnected from the world around them. The movement was a reminder that change could come from the ground up, and that even the most unlikely heroes could make a difference. 1977 was a year of highs and lows, of celebration and rebellion. It was a time when music, politics, and culture intersected in ways that continue to influence us today. Elvis Presley's world was a far cry from the chaotic, rebellious energy of punk. Punk was all about breaking the rules, challenging the status quo, and connecting with the crowd. It was raw, unfiltered, and intense. The Sex Pistols, The Clash, and Elvis Costello were the new voices, and they didn't care about the old ways. They were all about the here and now, the passion and the anger. Elvis, on the other hand, had become a symbol of the past, a performer who, despite his early rebellious image, had settled into a routine that felt more like a show than a connection. In the early days, Elvis was a revolutionary. He took elements from rhythm and blues, country, and gospel, and created something new and exciting. He was the king of rock and roll, and he owned the stage. But as the years went on, his music became repetitive. His movies were forgettable, and his Vegas shows were more about spectacle than art. Elvis had lost the spark that made him unique. He was stuck in a cycle of repetition, and it showed. he wasn't curious about new music or new ideas. Instead, he was content with his success, even if it meant he was no longer pushing boundaries. Punk, in contrast, was all about pushing boundaries. It was about the individual, the small venues, and the intense, personal connection between the band and the audience. The first time I saw Dr. Feelgood at the Nag's Head in High Wycombe, I knew something was changing. The energy was different, and it was infectious. Soon I was seeing bands like The Clash, The Jam, and The Damned in tiny clubs, feeling the music in a way I never had before. It was more than just entertainment. It was a movement, a way of life. One of the most memorable concerts from that era was when the Ramones played at Friars in Aylesbury. We had no idea what to expect from the support act, Talking Heads, but they were incredible. They looked like preppies but played like scientists, introducing each song with a simple, almost robotic, "The name of this song is." Then the Ramones came on, and it was like nothing I had ever seen. They didn't waste a second, diving straight into their songs with a raw, unfiltered energy. It was a wall of sound, a physical environment of noise. It was chaotic, and it was perfect. Elvis, however, couldn't have been more different. He was a product of a different time, a different world. He loved the classics, the rhythm and blues, and the old Hollywood stars like Marlon Brando. When he finally met Brando in the Paramount commissary, Elvis was shy and excited, like a fan meeting their idol. But Brando, known for his own rebellious spirit, didn't share the same admiration. He later criticized Elvis, saying he was a drug addict who took rock and roll from black culture and claimed it as his own. By 1977, Elvis was a far cry from the rebellious icon he once was. He had become a good all-boy, surrounded by men and comfortable in his routine. He didn't like competition, and he certainly didn't understand the punk movement. He had broken the mold himself, and the last thing he wanted was a bunch of new rebels shaking things up. He wanted to be the only one on that stage, the only one connecting with the crowd. But the world had moved on, and Elvis was left behind. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died at the age of 42. He was found in the bathroom of his Graceland mansion, surrounded by syringes and pills. His body was already stiff, and his face was buried in the carpet. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, discovered him, and despite desperate attempts to revive him, it was too late. Elvis was gone, and with him, an era of music and culture came to an end. The day Elvis died, the world of rock and roll lost its king. But the punk movement, with its raw energy and rebellion, was just beginning. It was a new era, and it was all about breaking the rules and making a new kind of connection. Elvis may have been the king, but the punks were the new rebels, and they were here to stay. The house was in chaos. Elvis's sudden collapse had thrown Graceland into a frenzy. Staff members were running around, some trying to help, others just getting in the way. The air was thick with confusion and fear. Some were crying, others were shouting, and everyone was trying to figure out what to do next. The noise was deafening, yet there was a strange silence too, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Elvis's bedroom was a scene of panic. Cleaners were quickly clearing away the dirty sheets. Maids were preparing the guest rooms, and bodyguards were bustling around like footmen in an old-fashioned mansion. The house was a mix of activity and stillness, with some people moving fast and others standing frozen, unsure of what to do. Elvis had always been the one giving orders, but now that he was lying motionless on the floor, there was no one to turn to for guidance. The thought of what would happen next was terrifying. Who would pay them? Where would they live? Would Vernon, Elvis's father, keep them on, or would Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, fire them all? In the bathroom, a dozen people were gathered, screaming and crying, pleading for someone to help Elvis. They tried everything, but it was too late. The man who had once been the king of rock and roll was gone. No longer would he sit up in bed, staring into space, his gaze bouncing off the black suede walls and the crimson drapes. No longer would he wander the halls in his robe and slippers, an unlit cigar in hand. The gilded hillbilly was no more. Elvis had been a force of nature, a rogue energy, a mutant beat, a symbol of teenage lust. But over the years, he had become bloated and over. His dreams had come true 100 times over, but this was where it all ended. The man who had risen from being a truck driver to the most famous man in America had slipped away in the most undignified way. His life was a metaphor for the post-war American dream, a story of excess and decline. As the news spread, things started to disappear from the house. Ornaments were stuffed into bags, watches were stolen from Elvis's dressing table, gold discs were snatched away, and even soiled tissues were taken as souvenirs. The police eventually secured the scene, but by then, much of the evidence was gone, and some of it was already being sold. When the emergency services arrived, they found Elvis unconscious on his bed, surrounded by Graceland employees and his personal doctor, Dr. George Nishapoulos. The medical technicians tried to revive him during the 7-minute ambulance ride to Baptist Hospital, but it was no use. The press was already waiting at the hospital, sensing the gravity of the situation. Elvis had been admitted to the hospital before, but this time it was different. The urgency was palpable. Dr. Nishapoulos, who had been prescribing Elvis a cocktail of drugs for years, made one last attempt to revive him. "Come on, Presley, breathe for me," he pleaded, but it was too late. At 3:30 p.m., he pronounced Elvis dead. He walked back to the anteroom where Vernon and the staff were waiting and simply said, "Elvis just left." Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, stepped outside and told the world, "My son Elvis is dead." The news sent shockwaves through the crowd. The Presley family consented to an immediate autopsy, which was performed that same evening. The autopsy revealed that Elvis's heart was 50% larger than normal, a sign of heart failure. Despite the presence of over a dozen drugs in his system, the official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia. Elvis's stepbrother, David Stanley, claimed that Elvis had deliberately taken all 3 of his nightly drug cocktails at once, suggesting suicide. However, this claim was disputed by others who were present. Regardless, the end was as ignominious as his rise had been glorious. The task of organizing the funeral fell to Robert Kendall, a local funeral director and Elvis's unofficial limo driver. When he arrived at the funeral home that afternoon, he had no idea what was about to happen. By 4 p.m., he learned that Elvis was dead. The news spread quickly, and by the time the white Cadillac funeral coach arrived at the hospital, the crowds were already massive. People were everywhere, some crying, some praying, some just standing in shock. Kendall and his assistants prepared Elvis's body for the viewing the next day. When they lifted the sheet to look at his face, one of Kendall's assistants said, "Now I believe Elvis really is dead." The low strains of Heartbreak Hotel played from a radio in the next room. "The king is dead," said another assistant. "Long live the king." Elvis was placed in a 900-pound steel-lined copper coffin. His face was bloated, and his sideburns were long, but even in death, he remained an icon. Back at Graceland, the house was in turmoil. Vernon was shaking, Lisa Marie was running around crying, and Ginger was in a daze. The grief was overwhelming, but there were also long-term plans to consider. Priscilla, Elvis's ex-wife, was in Los Angeles when she heard the news. She raced home, her mind in turmoil, and when she arrived, she confirmed her worst fears. Outside Graceland, the scene was chaotic. Fans from all over the country were flocking to Memphis, some driving for hours just to be there. The area in front of the mansion was filled with people, some kneeling on the road, some praying, some just standing in shock. The traffic was backed up for miles, but no one could bring themselves to move. The city of Memphis announced that flags would be flown at half-mast until the funeral. That night, a candlelight vigil was held outside Graceland. People left flowers, poems, photographs, teddy bears, and even women's panties as tributes. The mood was one of disbelief and sorrow, as if everyone was hoping that they would wake up to find that it had all been a bad dream. Elvis was gone, but his legacy lived on. The king was dead, but his music would continue to inspire generations to come. The night Elvis Presley died, the country felt a profound sense of loss. People gathered in churches and homes, mourning as if they had lost a family member. Elvis was more than just a singer. He was a symbol of the American dream, a teenager who had defied the norms and built his own path. Now that dream was gone, and the nation couldn't believe it. On August 17th, Elvis's body lay in state at Graceland, his beloved home. The public viewing was supposed to last only 2 hours, but the crowd was so large that the gates stayed open for an extra 90 minutes. A white linen carpet was placed under the casket to protect the mansion's rug. Elvis was dressed in a cream-colored suit, a blue shirt, and a striped silver tie. His father, Vernon, had bought the suit for him, but Elvis never got to wear it. Elvis had always been close to his mother, and he once said he wanted to die on the same day as her, August 14th. He missed it by just 2 days. Some people believed his mother was actually older than she claimed, but that didn't matter now. The focus was on Elvis and how he looked in the casket. The makeup on his face and hands was carefully applied to make him look more lifelike, but some fans still thought it didn't look like him. Rumors started that it wasn't Elvis in the casket, but a wax dummy. These rumors only added to the grief and confusion. The heat in Memphis was intense, and people were fainting left and right. Despite the high temperatures, the public was told they could wear whatever they wanted. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, wore a Hawaiian shirt and baseball cap, looking out of place among the grieving fans. When Jerry Weintraub, a film producer, visited Graceland, he found Parker arguing with Vernon about selling T-shirts to the fans. Despite the heat and the crowds, about 30,000 people managed to pay their respects. Among them were famous faces like Caroline Kennedy and James Brown. Brown, unlike some who accused Elvis of stealing black music, believed Elvis deserved all the praise. Elvis gave black people a voice, he said. I was his brother. We never argued about who was better. Elvis was a hard worker, dedicated, and God loved him. After the public viewing, Elvis's family had a private moment with him. Priscilla and Lisa Marie, his ex-wife and daughter, placed a silver bracelet on his wrist. Vernon, his father, was the last to kiss the coffin. He had to be helped away, overwhelmed by the loss. The city of Memphis felt heavy, as if a dark cloud had descended. People went about their business, but the absence of their famous resident was palpable. The driveway at Graceland was lined with wreaths, including a giant pair of blue suede shoes and a hound dog-shaped floral tribute. The crowd outside was a mix of grief and determination, with fans lining the streets, sitting on the curbs, and lying in the grass. Some tried to climb the wall around Graceland, while others brought candles and cameras. Fast food trucks sold snacks to the hungry crowd, and vendors hawked Elvis memorabilia, from T-shirts to empty pill vials. The sky turned peach as the sun set, and paramedics helped distressed fans. Many had been waiting since the previous evening, without food or drink. The graffiti on the wall around Graceland reflected the fans' emotions, from heartfelt tributes to inappropriate messages. One fan, a 9-year-old girl named Mary, picked a handful of grass and clutched it tightly, saying, "This is Elvis Presley's grass, and he'll never be dead in my heart." The night was long, and some fans stayed up, having driven from far away to be there. They were there for reasons they couldn't fully explain, but they shared a deep connection to Elvis. A mother of 6, Nancy Childers, drove all night from Atlanta saying, "I'll always love him, I'll just never get over it." The next morning, a tragic prelude to the funeral occurred when a drunk driver crashed into the crowd, killing 2 teenagers. The flowers were moved to Forest Hill Cemetery, where Elvis was to be buried. The funeral service was held in Graceland's music room, with gospel songs and eulogies from close friends and family. Pastor C.W. Bradley spoke candidly about Elvis's flaws, but emphasized his good qualities. After the service, Elvis's body was driven to the cemetery in a white Cadillac, followed by a long procession of cars. At the cemetery, Elvis was entombed in a white marble mausoleum. Before closing the casket, Kendall placed an ID vial with a note inside. He realized he would be the last person to see Elvis's face. The crowd's silent intensity was overwhelming, and many compared Elvis's death to that of a cultural icon like Robert E. Lee. After the funeral, over 50,000 people visited the cemetery to pay their respects. However, an attempt to steal Elvis's body led to the family deciding to move him and his mother to the meditation garden at Graceland. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, remained quiet throughout the funeral, choosing to mourn in private. When asked what he would do now, he simply said, "I'll go right on managing him." Elvis's death left a void that many felt deeply. Bob Dylan, a fellow musician, said, "When I first heard Elvis's voice, I just knew that I wasn't going to work for anybody, and nobody was going to be my boss." The loss of Elvis was more than the loss of a singer. It was the loss of a symbol of hope and dreams for a generation. Elvis Presley's impact on music and culture was so profound that even those who had complicated relationships with him couldn't help but feel the shock of his sudden death. Johnny Cash, for instance, despite his long-standing rivalry with Elvis, spoke with deep respect and admiration. "June and I loved and admired Elvis Presley," he said. "We join his family, friends, and loved ones in mourning his death. He was the king of us all in country, rock, folk, and rhythm and blues. I never knew an entertainer who had his personal magnetism and charisma. The women loved him, and the men couldn't help watching him. His presence filled every room he walked in. He, of course, will never be forgotten, and his influence will always be felt and reflected in the music world." Carl Perkins, a close friend and fellow musician, was even more emotional. "We've lost the most popular man that ever walked on this planet since Christ himself was here," he said. Perkins later reflected on Elvis's unique blend of looks, moves, and talent. "The world attention that came upon him so fast opened the door for most all of us. This boy had everything. He had the looks, the moves, the manager, and the talent. And he didn't look like Mr. Ed like a lot of the rest of us did. In the way he looked, way he talked, way he acted, he really was different." For Bob Dylan, Elvis's death hit particularly hard. Dylan, who once said that when he first heard Elvis's voice, he knew he wouldn't work for anyone else, fell into a deep depression. "When I first heard Elvis's voice, I just knew that I wasn't going to work for anybody, and nobody was going to be my boss. Hearing Elvis's voice for the first time was like busting out of jail," he said on the 10th anniversary of Elvis's death. Dylan's entire career, his self-invention, was deeply influenced by the king. Even Frank Sinatra, who had once criticized Elvis's music, was touched. At a performance in East Troy, Wisconsin, he told the audience, "We lost a good friend today." Pat Boone, a contemporary of Elvis, added, "There's no way to measure the impact he made on society or the void that he leaves." Sammy Davis Jr. described Elvis as having something just bordering on rudeness. "He never actually did anything rude, but he always seemed as if he was just going to. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would rate him 11. Paul Anka, who got to know Elvis during their time in Vegas, saw the signs of his decline. "Life is about construction and destruction," Anka recalled. "When you lose track of that, you self-destruct. And that's what happened to my talented friend. He was a cool guy, a nice man, but was too young to go, really blew it. So locked in that prison of celebrity, of who he was and his image, the person inside shriveled up." John Lennon, who was in Japan with Yoko Ono when Elvis died, had a more cynical view. "Elvis died when he went into the army," he said. When asked again about Elvis just before his own death, Lennon grimly quipped, "It's the courtiers that kill the king." Rod Stewart was straightforward in his admiration. "Elvis was the king, no doubt about it. People like myself, Mick Jagger, and all the others only followed in his footsteps." Mick Fleetwood of Fleetwood Mac was driving back from the hills around LA when he heard the news. "I thought great, and then they came back with the news. I learned music listening to Elvis's records. His measurable effect on culture and music was even greater in England than in the States." Suzi Quatro, a glam rock star, was in Los Angeles auditioning for a role when she heard the news. "I was excited and devastated at the same time. I was to play the role of Leather Tuscadero, but the news of Elvis's death was a shock." Joanna Lumley, an actress, was filming in Toronto when the news broke. She was deeply affected, feeling a personal connection to Elvis since she was a young girl. "To my horror and disbelief, no one on the set seemed remotely touched by an event which was for me a seismic sorrow. They were pygmies, scuffling and sniggering around the fallen hero, kicking his reputation into the dirt to get a cheap laugh." David Bowie, a lifelong fan, was as shocked as anyone. He even considered recording a tribute album, with Iggy Pop singing classic Elvis songs. Bowie's first ever performance at age 11 was an Elvis impersonation for a Boy Scout audience. He had studied Elvis's stage presence and incorporated elements into his own performances. Elvis had the choreography. He had a way of looking at the world that was totally original, totally naive, and totally available as a blueprint. Who wouldn't want to copy Elvis? Elvis had it all. Bowie's song, Golden Years, was initially written for Elvis. When Elvis turned it down, Bowie included it on his own album, Station to Station. "I would have loved working with him. God, I would have adored it," Bowie said. He had even received a note from Elvis, which he cherished. Bowie's admiration for Elvis extended to his stage presence and visual style. He used elements of Elvis's choreography and stage persona, from the way he stood to the way he ended his songs. Bowie's Ziggy Stardust character was heavily influenced by Elvis's magnetism and stage presence. Elvis had it all. It wasn't just the music that was interesting, it was everything else, and he had a lot of everything else. Elvis's influence was so profound that it shaped not just the music, but the entire culture of rock and roll. His legacy lived on through the artists he inspired, from Bob Dylan to David Bowie, from Rod Stewart to Paul Anka. Even in death, Elvis Presley remained the king, a symbol of the power and the price of fame. David Bowie and Elvis Presley, two giants of music, had a unique connection that transcended the music they made. Bowie, with his ever-changing personas and artistic explorations, always carried a piece of Elvis with him. This was evident in the way he moved on stage, the way he commanded a crowd, and even in the subtle nods he made to Elvis's iconic style. Bowie once shared a story about catching Elvis's show at Madison Square Garden. Dressed in his flamboyant Ziggy Stardust attire, Bowie felt like he was under a microscope as he walked into the arena. Despite the attention, he was determined to see Elvis, his childhood hero. The moment Elvis locked eyes with him, Bowie felt a mix of excitement and embarrassment. Elvis was in his prime, and Bowie felt the weight of their shared history in that moment. Years later, at the Milton Keynes Bowl in 1983, Bowie's performance showed just how much Elvis had influenced him. Bowie didn't look like Elvis or sound like him, but the way he carried himself, the intensity in his eyes, and his connection with the crowd, all of it echoed Elvis's legendary presence. It was as if Bowie had absorbed the essence of what made Elvis so captivating and made it his own. Elvis's version of Golden Years might have been something extraordinary, and it's easy to imagine how he would have interpreted Bowie's fame. By the mid-1970s, Elvis was already a different man, often imitating his younger self. But his performance of Fame would have been layered with meaning, blending his classic rock and roll style with the disco rhythms of the time. Bowie's appearance on Soul Train in 1975 was a rare moment for a white artist, and it's fun to imagine what would have happened if Elvis had been the one on stage. Picture Elvis in a rhinestone jumpsuit, backed by a trio of soulful singers, and his band turning Fame into a rock and roll masterpiece. It would have been a moment that could have changed the course of pop culture. Elvis's death in 1977 left a void that no one could fill. Bruce Springsteen, another fan, was devastated. He had tickets to see Elvis perform at Madison Square Garden, and felt a deep sense of loss. Springsteen and his bandmate Steve Van Zandt drove into the desert, capturing the spirit of Elvis in a series of photographs. These images remain some of the most iconic of Springsteen's career, showing him as a true rock star, much like Elvis in his prime. Springsteen described Elvis as the first modern 20th century man, a cultural icon who broke down barriers and inspired generations. Elvis's influence was so profound that it shaped the lives of countless musicians, including Springsteen and his bandmates. Elvis's death was a shock to many, but it also served as a reminder of the fragility of life and the impact one person can have. For those who knew him, like Isaac Tigret, the news was devastating. Tigret, who had grown up in Tennessee, felt the loss deeply and played Heartbreak Hotel in memory of the king. Elvis Presley may have left us too soon, but his legacy lives on. He was more than just a musician. He was a symbol of the American dream, a trailblazer who dared to be different. In the end, Elvis remains the one and only king, a legend whose influence continues to inspire and captivate new generations.